everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to take a moment after welcoming you all to this wonderful event for Brídín and Natalie's book.
You need to hold the microphone.
Yes, that might be part of it.
We're learning.
Yes, that is better. Yes, after welcoming you all to this event, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that we are gathered on the Lenape-Hoking ancestral lands of the Lenape people, which settlers call New York City. We do this with humility and with gratitude, while recognizing the violent forced relocation and displacement of the Lenape peoples, with whom we as individuals at this university are in an ongoing process of learning. We also want to take a moment to acknowledge that the city that we're in was built with the labor of enslaved people. And I will pass it to Natalie to speak to the author's relationship to Palestine and solidarity.
Yeah, it just felt important to name while we are in this building owned by this university that we stand with the people of Palestine and everyone who protests with them all over the world. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie, and I'm a recent graduate of the MA in Arts Politics program. I'm a cultural worker who's been working in South Africa with dancers and different festivals on interdisciplinary programs.
And my name is Delaney. I'm going to be one of your other moderators for tonight. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an associate production manager with Aurora Productions, a Broadway production management company. I have worked with a number of other arts organizations in New York for the last 3 years after graduating from college, including the Tank and New York Theater Workshop and Ars Nova. And I worked with Brídín and Natalie on this book as one of their research assistants. And now we'll take a moment briefly to introduce the authors of this book. Natalie, if you'd like to go first.
Mm-hmm. So Brídín, you're going to be a ping ball. Brídín Clements Cotton is an arts manager, educator, and maker, currently an arts instructor for stage and project management at NYU Abu Dhabi. She has held a variety of management and teaching roles at arts organizations and educational institutions. Her approach to facilitating collaboration is driven by belief in the potential with theater as a space for human connection and interest in how gatherings can create collective meaning.
And now I'll take a moment to introduce Natalie. Natalie Robin is a lighting designer, labor organizer, and educator. She is a full-time organizer for United Scenic Artists, Local USA 829 of IATSE, of which she is a proud and lifelong member. Previously, she taught at several institutions of higher education, and she believes everybody should have protections of a union and is committed to deconstructing the traditional capitalist, hierarchical, ego-driven collaborative structures for theater making. And throughout this event, we're going to do a little bit of a question period with the authors of the book, and then turn it over to Brídín for a brief interactive activity with the audience members. And we'll take questions from the audience to follow. So first, speaking to the two of you a little bit about what the process was like for writing this book. The book is organized into 3 principal sections, which break down how labor got to this point in the American theater culture, and what the climate is like now, and what you envision happening in the future. Could you speak a little bit to why you chose the structure for this book?
I can begin. Thank you, Delaney and Natalie, and NYU Abu Dhabi Institute for having us. It's really nice to see everybody here. The 3 sections of the book. So we knew that we were interested in writing about theater production workers, specifically production workers, thinking about the folks working in sort of technicians, designers, production managers, stage managers, sort of on the periphery of our scope. And we knew that in order to think about the sort of worker experience, we needed to contextualize it in looking at the history, and specifically the history of who has had access to these careers, and where we are now, and then introduce our research. And then we knew that we would then like to get really specifically into education, career access, and then different stages of the sort of worker employee life cycle of what that means in production. And then beyond that, I think we didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we maybe didn't even know that much actually at the beginning, but you know, it's logical, like chronologically logical, to talk about what happened before, what's happening now, and what we hope will happen in the future. we did not write the book in order. And so, but having the arc of it was really helpful in terms of, I mean, I don't know, how could we possibly know where we're going to go if we don't know where we've been? It just like, there's many things that did not make it into the book and many things that we didn't know would be in the book when we started. So it wasn't so clear at the beginning, but I think, yeah, it needed a logical structure in order for us to be able to work back and forth as we were writing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a hope is that you could look at any section or any chapter in context of the progression of the book or as a standalone piece of material. Yeah. So definitely section 1, where we really, I think, contextualize the conversation. Each of those chapters could be a useful resource, we hope, within itself. And then section 2, really looking at labor and safety, production operations, people operations. The hope is that there is a logic to that order, but also you could jump around. And then the reimagining section, which is where we landed with the 3rd section of the book, is just sort of, I feel like it's where we got to with this research and then asking questions about the future.
Mm-hmm. I feel like, do we need to stop and make the screen go away, or is it okay? Oh, there it goes. Okay, great. Sorry, yeah.
Our stage manager is on stage.
Well, you know, in the preface, you both go to pains to sort of put your identity out there, to place yourselves in terms of who you are in doing this work. Can you talk about how that maybe is a way of reflecting on the industry, but also sort of modeling something? How did that, come to be, and what do you see it functioning as?
Mm-hmm. I think, one of the things that it felt really important for us to name is that we were able to do this work because of a pretty significant amount of privilege. We started this book when I was a full-time faculty member at University of the Arts. We worked on the book for a long time while I was on a funded sabbatical with funding from the university. We received funding from NYU, Abu Dhabi, and NYU, New York? No, sorry.
A lot of support from NYU Abu Dhabi.
And so so it felt important to name that other people have been doing the work we are talking about and do not have the privilege to take the time and stop and reflect. And so that also our identities shape the careers that we have, whether we want to admit that or not. But especially as our research developed and we were really looking at how harmful the culture of interconnected networks can be in this field, it felt really important to name how we then situate ourselves. And also just organically to say who are these random people who have decided that we can write this book? We want you to know who we are as you meet the material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you spoke about some of the current privileges that we had that gave us that supported our writing this book. But then we really wanted to also trace many of the privileges that we've had throughout our lives, particularly in regards to our access to arts education and to these careers. So thinking about how we both encountered arts in our early education, the various degree programs we've had the opportunity to go through, the various unpaid internships and underpaid work that we've each had a chance to do to then get us to where we are, as well as our identities as white women.
Yeah. Also to name that all 4 of us have degrees from this institution, which is one of those privileges all by itself.
Very true. And I think, sort of building in a similar way to the awareness that you're displaying in writing this book, right, is that you also spend a lot of time putting theater work in relation to other fields and saying that what is happening in theater production is not an anomaly. It's not the only industry that is precarious. Can you talk about how, can you talk about the choice to really put that in conversation? Because I think sometimes the myopia that we can have about our individual industries sort of prevents us from seeing what is possible. And so what are some of the lessons and maybe relations to things that are going on in other industry that you bring to this work?
Yeah, maybe I can begin with sort of part of where the book came from in terms of I studied stage management in undergrad at NYU Tisch. And in undergrad, I took one class in Wagner, the public policy school here. And I started and it was in management and leadership. And I was very struck by why are we not thinking about this type of management and leadership as much when we think about the arts? Because that's where we were doing these case studies and exercises and how to facilitate, not specific to any one field. Then I continued and worked in various positions in the arts. And then while working at Tisch, I pursued public policy and public administration for my master's. And that's when I really started, I was taking these classes in HR, in performance measurement and management in the workplace, in how boards of directors function as governance of organizations, and learning about how other types of organizations function. And I kept coming back to these things, like questions of why arts workplaces are so different, and all these ways that we think we're extraordinary, so we don't have any sort of standardized hiring practices, right? We're extraordinary, so this and this and this, and that's a bit of where our conversation stemmed from.
Yeah, I think too that like one of the ways that we can make this industry better is by acknowledging that artists are also workers, and that the capital A artistry does not negate that we are selling our labor just like everyone else. And it feels important to name that like we share a lot with other workers. We share a lot with workers in the restaurant industry. We share a lot with gig-based workers. We share a lot with workers in the building trades. In fact, many of our workers do the same work that folks in the building trades do, except we expect the theater workers to have well, apparently if you graduate from this institution, a $400,000 BFA, to do the work that a union carpenter does after finishing an apprenticeship that they've been paid to do, in which they learn their craft. And like these just felt really important to think about. Why are we blind? Why are we intentionally blinding ourselves by giving ourselves the label of artist? And as a labor organizer in the arts, like a huge part of my work is about trying to navigate. It's not about lessening the artistry, but it is about naming that it is still work. And so it felt important. And actually, research that is not in the book that we did was about like other fields that feel related, or like other jobs that people who, like, what are other things that are like set design, and how are those fields maybe less susceptible to some of these things and equally susceptible, but like it felt so important to connect this artwork to non-artwork or less artistic work, or whatever weird classing thing we want to say about that. Yeah.
I think going off of what you were just saying, the specificity of the arts world and the kind of fallacious attitude that exists around that is abundant throughout this book, speaking about arts as if it's somehow uniquely different from the building trade, from restaurant workers, from things of that sort. Something really destabilizing that I noticed while I was reading this book was a quote from Dr. Karen Morash, which reads, it's worth querying whether there is something in the nature of the performing arts industry which creates conditions conducive to exploitation. And as an arts worker myself, I hadn't previously considered that, but it certainly made sense as I read your commentary in the book about what about the arts industry, the emotionality of it, the proximity to so much vulnerability, both physical vulnerability in working in a theater hanging lights or being up on a ladder, and the emotional vulnerability of acting, which is not hit on as often in the book, but is still certainly a valuable point to consider. What inherently makes that more dangerous? So if you two could speak to what about this industry, specifically the discipline of technical theater, facilitates exploitation and abuse, that would be great.
Sure.
Yeah, I can contextualize.
Yes. Great. I'm going to say the non-practice thing, and then Bree will say the smart thing. I mean, part of it is not just about theater, but it is the assumption and dependence that employers have on the workers that because we love the thing, we will sacrifice for the thing. And that is endemic of the arts, it's endemic of not-for-profits, it's endemic of higher ed, it's endemic of healthcare and education, right? Like all of the fields where we see continual worker exploitation includes this, but you care, but you love the thing. And so therefore it's okay if we pay you less because somehow you're like making some satisfying something by loving it. And so it feels important to like shatter that myth. Yeah. You know?
Yeah, I thank you for pointing out that text. And I wanted to just note, so Dr. Karen Morash is a London-based theater scholar, and the specific piece that we reference is Acting Unpleasantly, Why Harassment is So Common in the Theater. And her research specifically looks at devised theater and how hierarchical processes often emerge, even when that's not the goal. So that was sort of what that quote is. The context of that quote. And I think we were looking specifically at some of the things that lead to this being the schedules, the long hours, the schedules.
Right, the show must go on
like mentality,
idea, yeah. Which we would like to reject.
And then that in parallel with safety.
Right, it's like all of these things get deprioritized because the humans get deprioritized in service of the art, which doesn't exist without the humans. So again, it's like, how do we situate? You don't expect people in other fields necessarily to sacrifice the way we expect people in these fields to sacrifice.
Yeah, I think another aspect of this that we focus a lot on throughout the book is about compensation, which you talk about in terms of the labor of love, but specifically thinking a lot about fee-based work, and is that structure ever not exploitative?
Yeah, certainly. Connected to that, I was struck, this is a through line throughout the book, about the idea of the egregore. I had never heard that analogy before, and I thought it was incredibly powerful. And the idea that simply replacing the leadership of problematic institutions doesn't resolve the longstanding issue central to the industry. If you were to remove all of the players from a problematic institution, the ideas that found the institution still persist. And I'm wondering, as an arts worker, how we, as theater workers, continue to work within this model while trying to change it, and when it's considered so much more sum of its parts than an individual thing that needs to be exercised.
This is the reason that I have notes, because I felt like we have to tell you a bit about this piece in order to then answer this question.
Right. Explaining what it is.
Maybe not everybody here is familiar with the concept of the egregore. So Jesse Cameron Alec, who is a dramaturg, researcher, artist, recently published, like in the last couple of years, a blog post essay called "The Spirit of the Thing: Why the American Theater Can't Change." And in this piece, he introduces the concept of the egregore, which is rooted in Hebrew mysticism, which is a non-physical entity that is made material and brought into existence by the collective belief of people. So it's a relatively short piece, but he really gets at this idea that there's this thing living in our walls, that even if we all left and other people came into these systems, the systems would still be there, and invites us to think about that and to think about, do we try to kill the egregore? Do we try to change it? Do we nurture it? Like, how do we deal with this thing that is in the bodies of these institutions? Tell us the question again.
Yeah.
No problem. To summarize it, how do we continue to work within problematic institutions that are so much more a sum of their parts than an individual thing?
We don't.
Yeah. We let them fail. I think, like, at the end of the day, this is the thing I say apparently every time, and then we have to let, in the way that it is, it makes no sense to let an institution that can't afford to pay people keep being in business. Like, we have to let them fail. And we have to stop, like, throwing ourselves onto the pyre of the American theater so that it can stay exactly the way it is. it's possible. I mean, it seems unlikely that theater will not exist, right? People have been telling stories in front of other people for the existence of humans. And there's nothing, it's possible that specifically the not-for-profit institutional theater model has lived its life. I think that, and not all of them maybe, but I think right, we can't, I mean, Audre Lorde tells us, right? You can't use the master's tools to, so like we have to let it go, and we have to be willing to walk away.
And I think this is an important moment to note that our research is specifically about the professional production work in the US. So we're not saying there shouldn't be any theater art anywhere, but we are thinking about theater that is then where this work is people's primary source of income. Yeah. So as you like to say, we can make art with our friends and not have it as a job.
Right. I mean, but it's, you know, there is this thing that there's this like missing gap, right? There's like, there's community theater, which is somehow like looked down upon by professional theater makers. And there's an idea that then all other theater has to sustain itself professionally. And like, maybe it doesn't. And maybe that's okay. And maybe then the theaters that can sustain themselves professionally could do that. But the resistance comes from inside also. Like, one of the really surprising things about our research to me was hearing about production workers' resistance to changes that would make their lives better. Production departments in institutional theaters where when an artistic director said, we're gonna work 5 days a week, we're gonna eliminate the unpaid internship, and we're gonna get rid of the 10 out of 12s, and we're gonna do fewer shows, half of the department quit. Right? So like, there's also that. Like, we have to see that there is a pathway as workers to something that is different and not feel like we have to stay inside this. Like, we don't have to feed the system. We don't have to feed the machine. And yeah.
Well, I think that goes back to this idea of the egregore, which is in the systems, but also in the culture. These things are so inherent, this belief in paying your dues. You know, this idea that like, well, I made it. I got to this place in my career by doing this and this and this. So why can't any person? You know, I think these things are really deeply in us.
And I mean, we hear it. It's shocking. I was at an event recently that was one of these end of year portfolio reviews, and I heard colleagues tell graduating students that it would be fine. They should just like take the unpaid work because it was really important to be in the room, and it was really important to like see how the art is made. And I was like, what? It's 2024. Like, why are we still saying this?
I was shocked to hear in a section of the book you talk about the mentality that you developed around this starting in middle school and high school. How early that comes.
Oh, yes. Sure. Yes. I mean, but isn't that where it starts, right? It starts in it starts in a place that's about, oh, I stayed up later. Like, who stayed up the latest?
That's what I'm referencing.
Who got the least amount of sleep? Who like painted the floor instead of going home? Like, there's just a million stories.
There's like a Pride Olympics thing that happens when you're doing theater and other activities as well, for sure. Right. Yeah.
But the theater part perpetuates. Like, then we get college theater where it looks like that, and then you get summer stock where it looks like that. And then we get
exhaustion as a badge.
Right. And it's like, we get to the point where the 10 out of 12 seems like not a long work day. For those of you who don't know, a 10 out of 12 is a period. It's a rehearsal term in which workers are in the theater for 12 hours, 10 of which they are working. Production workers are typically working a 14 or 16-hour day around that 10-hour rehearsal period. So that seems like a short day because you're not sleeping in the theater. I mean, it just perpetuates itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in a lot of what we heard from workers, we heard that these things that are problematic in the workplace initially were part of what drew them into theater, because that also is what creates this feeling of family. You know, any of us who did theater in high school remember, you know, the cast parties and after the show ends and all of this and striking the show and that feeling. And it's that then leads in the professional workplace to many of the unsustainable and unhealthy workplace practices.
And it leaves out people who can't do it. Like, what, you know, it leaves out people who need jobs that will pay them to be housed and fed. It leaves out caretakers who can't be like away from the person they're caring for that much time. It leaves out
any other responsibilities.
Yeah. It just leaves out everyone.
Yeah, no, that's a good place to get to this question of like, how then do we organize differently, right? Because if people are fed by that sense of camaraderie in all its problematic shades, what is the process of shifting the labor structure around us so that we're still receiving camaraderie, but it's not, a terrible experience that is eroding people's well-being? What are the ways in which you can see either some gains that have come out of, I love how you guys call the pandemic the pause, so poetic. What are some of the things that we've seen emerge that you think there are ways we can preserve those, and we can also make sure that they don't stay in small repertory theater, but they also make it onto like Broadway and bigger theaters? What are the ways in which maybe there are even gains we've not begun to make because of the ways people are resistant? What is some of the organizing or shifting of the ways that we're doing things that we could get us closer to what you also poetically call the imaginings? And maybe you can help people know just like what some of those ideas are.
Yeah, I mean, I think just a very quick initial response to this is like, you can make art in a 5-day work week. Like that shouldn't be that crazy a place of, that's a very in a way, a simple answer, right? Which is many fields operate with 5-day work weeks where people have a time that they go home to their families and their other responsibilities and could go to doctor's appointments, and like that's a very simple thing.
Yeah, we can believe that people can replace us. Like you can take a sick day and it's okay. I mean, there's so much of it that's about like, again, it's connected to the exceptionalism, right? And it's connected to the badge of honor. But I think too that we can take responsibility for the situations. And I think this is a thing that has to happen at every level. But for me, when we talk about, I think if you have enough money to produce one show, you should produce one show and not 4 shows, right? But also, the American theater is so happy to spend money on stuff and so unhappy to spend money on people. And like, gosh, what a crazy idea. Recently I was with some colleagues and one of them made the point to say that, like, she's a set designer, and she said, when I design a show and I get paid $3,000 and the budget for the show is $3,000, I feel sort of fine. But when the budget for the show is for the scenery is $75,000 and I'm still making $3,000, I have questions. And the resistance from, and any of you who are in places to try to advocate for this, I'm sure met it, the resistance from management against reallocating money to labor over stuff is just astronomical. Like, there's just always more money when the set doesn't work, or like you need more moving lights, or you need like an extra microphone, or whatever the turntable doesn't work. But there's weirdly not money for another crew person, for people to get raises, for like, I don't know, an assistant to be paid weekly and be around for the whole show. It's just, and that shift it just feels so important to center the humanity of people in the art instead of the product, especially in the not-for-profit theater, where the money is limited in a different way.
Yeah. I mean, so I think, Natalie, you're getting at this theme that came up for us throughout the process, is really thinking about budgets as a value statement, and that most nonprofit organizations, if not all, and also many commercial productions, do state their values, and we don't always see those in what's happening on the ground with the workers. And one hope of ours with this book and with providing, qualitative data, which we know can be a useful tool in these conversations, and just an academic text in general, is that folks making these funding decisions and building these budgets could use this in thinking about how their budgets act as what do or don't demonstrate these values.
You also want to just say a little bit about what some of these imaginings are that that may be beyond what you've touched on about worker-centric policies, just so that people have a sense of where you're pointing the future towards.
I think we can just share the 4 broad
Great.
themes.
Do you remember them? Quiz on a book we wrote 2 years ago.
So, I mean, one thing that I think we were thinking a lot throughout this process and did land on as sort of one of our themes in thinking about the future is the idea of universal design in designing items, homes, anything for every single person, and universal design in how we design our workplaces. So in how does the tech process function in a way that any person could be a designer on that show? How does the rehearsal process function in the way that any person could come in and be an assistant stage manager in that room, which I feel like does not, every time we came back to this concept, it felt very obvious and like, do we need to talk about this to me? But then when you think about the fact that our whole, our entire communication process in tech is on headsets, it's dark backstage.
Yeah,
Many
there are
different
stairs
things that
everywhere.
are access barriers to many workers. So one of the first themes in our reimagining questions has to do with the idea of universal design when we think about the workplace and our systems, both in the physical, tangible, and then at every level as we're redesigning the workplace or reimagining the workplace.
I don't remember what the themes are. I could look in the book. I mean, can I talk about education?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
education and shared research.
oh, great. Yeah, thanks. The education that pairs with a theater career is a degree from an academy, from a 4-year institution, maybe a graduate degree, and then some kind of unpaid or underpaid educational experience in which your labor is exchanged for maybe some learning. I really believe that the American Regional Theater was founded on an idea of education. Like, I believe that people thought that's what they were doing, that they were exchanging an education in the arts for work. But I'm sorry, when unpaid interns are cleaning bathrooms, that is not what's happening. And when unpaid interns are replacing workers who would be paid for the same labor, that's not what's happening. So we need to really there should be no unpaid or underpaid work. And we need to really investigate ways of providing education that are not based on the academy, and capital A academy, right? I spend a lot of time with labor workers in other parts of the labor movement, and I'm really inspired by things like IBEW Local 3, so the electrical workers in New York. When you go, their apprentice program is 3 years long. You are paid to do it, and you finish it with an associate's degree. Like, that seems so obvious, right? And some of those people go on and finish a 4-year degree, and some don't. But they've been paid to learn their craft, and they've been provided with this education, which comes with a lot of classes. They have to do a lot of work to do that. But the capital A art part gets in the way of the work training, and that puts a requirement for a degree on something that doesn't need a degree.
This feels like a moment to recognize that we both have participated in unpaid internship programs in many ways, including running them. I think some of our former unpaid interns and colleagues are in this room.
Sorry, Rebecca.
And in them. And that's a lot of where this thinking came out of, was being a part of those processes in different ways. But just to note.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And then another theme that came in the sort of reimaginings, and as we were thinking about the future, is shared resources in a number of different ways. Shared resources and collaborative leadership and shared leadership models, which are different and separate, depending what we're thinking about. So as simple as shared shop resources, shared tangible, physical resources. Do you want to speak about that? Because I think you've worked more from.
Yeah, I just think the idea that everybody doesn't have to own everything individually, that we can share things. Also, we can reuse things if theater A has the thing that theater B needs, it could go there in a very tangible way. And also in terms of human resources, like how can there's some really beautiful models. We specifically talk about an HR model in Pittsburgh where a single HR human serves 5 arts organizations because none of them need or can afford a full-time HR department. And it's just like, oh, that seems, I mean, it's not perfect, and we talk about that in the book, but it's getting at something about building community and letting community drive things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you saying like it's not perfect is important and to think about in that these reimaginings will really take iterating, and that was a big step, right, for these 5 organizations to come together and pool their resources. They discussed how they had to have some value alignment. They had to agree on systems that may not fit in with the rest of their administrative systems for that to work. And they were still.
And that program has ended.
Yeah, the person's not in that role anymore.
Seems like a great idea.
But iterating, trying these things, we do think could solve a lot of the questions that came up throughout our research about how these workplaces function. And then thinking about shared leadership, a lot of the issues we've seen have to do with the hierarchical model in much of the nonprofit theaters. And there's various levels of what shared leadership structures can look like. So there's pretty commonly an artistic director, executive director relationship, but that doesn't really.
Right. We talk about that as like, that's like a 2-headed monster or something, right? Yeah. Like it's still a hierarchy. It's still like a decision maker and a bunch of people under the decision maker.
But like Detroit Public Theater, for example, has 3 artistic directors and a 4-person shared executive structure where they really, really share in those responsibilities, which potentially means there's not a person making the exorbitant artistic director salaries that we see at some nonprofits, but it also means there's no one person holding that responsibility, getting that pushback from donors, from the public, from anybody, making artistic decisions and budgetary decisions.
I think one of the things we learned too is we did some research into how boards work. We talked to some board members. There's some interesting abdication of responsibility from board members who are responsible for the financial health of an institution. But like there's a real trust in the sort of like middle layer, which is like executive leadership of the theater, that this big decision making money-wise is being used correctly. And that some really engaged and interested board members who we talked to still were like, it's not my job to know what the carpenters are making. Maybe it is. Right? Because like, again, to the value, like if the board is setting the values, there's a collaboration in that way too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in that line of thinking, there's just this, it puts this great reliance on a single or 2 people in these leadership roles to be, the governance structure funneling into those people and then out to the entire operations. And so much of what we're seeing has to do with that. And as we're seeing these organizations end, their lives change, like I think a lot of it does have to do with this structure.
Well, and I think it goes back to this question too about the like inheriting of the system, even if you change all the people. And what we see, I mean, many of the people who we interviewed in this book who had done amazing work are no longer in the positions that they were in. And in many cases, right, we saw a huge, I mean, just to name it, we saw a huge upsurge in the hiring of BIPOC leaders into these institutions that were rife with all of these systemic problems. Many of those leaders were set up to fail. Many of them either left because they had hit a wall that was insurmountable or were relieved of their positions, regardless of the narrative that the institutions tell us. I mean, in the case of Stephanie Ibarra, who we talked to, who was at Baltimore Center Stage, who did amazing work there, she left and went to a different a non-theater institution. In the case of Natalie Garrett, who we spoke to when she was still at OSF, who shared some really amazing insights with us, Natalie did that job as the artistic director of Oregon Shakes while getting active death threats and paying for personal security to be able to do this job, and then left. And I know that now I'm going to say this on the record, but rumor has it that she did not leave entirely of her own choice, right? But at the very least, she was set up to fail because that institution has decades of financial mismanagement that she didn't even know about, let alone couldn't have fixed. And so I think this is related, which is that you can't just change the leadership and fix the problem.
And on a personal level, what a unsafe situation we're putting those leaders to in terms of psychological and physical safety.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And just because we don't want to hog the conversation here, you're going to lead us into a moment before we open up the floor.
We wanted everybody to come away from here with something, a gift. So when you arrived, you had a little book, a zine on your chair. Hopefully everyone had them. In my travels, it's been a bit scattered. We were thinking, so if you unfold it, you get a piece of paper. And you have a pencil, I hope. Or if you can think about this, or you can write in your own journal if you'd prefer. But we wanted to ask each person to think about the first job that you ever had, the first job you ever did for money. So for me, I worked at the Taste of Kalamazoo and Island Festival with Carver in a ticket booth for, I think, 6 years of my life, starting around the time I was 12.
I shelved books in the public library for $3.50 an hour.
And what did you wish that you had known then? And we invite you to write a letter or a note to yourself then. So think about the first job that you ever did and write yourself a little note, a letter of something that you wish you had known then.
We're just going to take a couple of minutes to do this, and then we'll come back for a Q&A.